to cloud. Okay. Well, good evening, brothers. Welcome to Thursday Night Education Series again, the second session of this series. As we said previously, this isn't a tiled meeting, so please, govern yourself according. These are recorded, as you saw me or heard me turn on the recording. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you do want to unmute yourself temporarily, you can use the space bar quickly to unmute and remute yourself. Send any questions via chat. We'll cover them at the end, and then we'll also open it up to questions via the voice as well at the end. I do plan on I'll post a link to a poll or a survey in the chat session closer to the end, and it'll also be in an email that comes out after the session. With that, we have the upcoming schedule coming up here. With Hermeticism and Kabbalah, sacred geometry, and a few other items. Please register for some of these upcoming sessions. And with that, we have the featured presentation for this evening, the history of the Minneapolis Scottish Rite Valley. Charlie, you can go ahead and share your screen, and it is all yours.
All right. Well, I'll try and figure this out here.
No, it's okay.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Beekman, part of the Education Committee at Scottish Rite, and proud member of Arcana 187. And I apologize up front. I am a bit of a technophobe and don't know how to operate computers. So my assistant Justin is here to make sure I don't mess this up too much. Share. Oh. Did it work? There it is. So this evening, I am going to tell you about a little bit of the history of Minnesota and its connection with Masonry, and then how the Minneapolis Valley comes about. So to start with, when you're looking at the history of Masonry in Minnesota, it's really hard to separate the founding of the state and the Masons that were involved with it. We were here before Minnesota was here. So let me see if I can share how to go to this next screen. Nope. Boom. There we go. So the history of Minnesota, it essentially starts with in 1849, we have the Organic Act that establishes the territory basically out of the land that Iowa and Wisconsin thought was garbage. So here we are. And then that happens in March of 49, and by August of 1849, we've already got the first lodge being established in Minnesota, which is in St. Paul, established or chartered by the Ohio Grand Lodge. Shortly after that, in 1853, we have the founding of the Grand Lodge of Minnesota, and our first Grand Master is actually the gentleman who spearheads the founding of the Minneapolis Valley, Alfred Elijah Ames. Then fast forward a little bit, and you've got 1858. We have Minnesota being admitted as the 32nd state in the Union, and all throughout the process of establishing the state, we have prominent Masons that are involved in the government, and I'm just going to name a couple that are important to our valley. Which here again we have Alfred Ames. He's in the 4th territorial legislation. He's in the House of Representatives. In 1857, he's a part of the Minnesota, the Constitutional Convention that establishes basically the rules for how the state's going to work. He was a prominent figure in Illinois prior to his moving to Minnesota. He was prominent in the local government there. And when he's here, he's a practicing doctor the whole time. And we also have Samuel Adams, who, for you guys who know me, you might know a little bit about my history. This is actually my 3rd great grandfather. So I know quite a bit about Sam. But Sam's goal in he's just got a long list. He's a part of the state board. He's a part of the school board. He has a presidential commission from President Pierce, making him the route agent between Boston and Burlington, Vermont. He's appointed postmaster of Iowa and Minnesota. He ultimately ends up with a presidential commission from Lincoln during the Civil War, which he actually leaves the Grand Lodge to go fight in the Civil War, where he's the paymaster, and he is operating out of a fort in Missouri. And for those of you who study history, you know that Missouri is actually split. And Sam's the guy that's on a horse carrying gold and silver to the front line to make sure those guys can still operate. So, and he ultimately gets named or bestowed the rank of lieutenant colonel after he serves in the Civil War. He's also a prominent member of the Grange. He's agricultural state board, and ends out his political career as alderman for Minneapolis. So we've got Masons peppered throughout all of the government as Minnesota's being established, and we're establishing lodges at the same time. And that kind of brings us up to speed in terms of where the Scottish Rite starts fitting into the story. In 1852, we have records of Albert Pike is already in the state visiting. He's communicating the degrees to people. A.T.C. Pearson at some point in there, I guess it's kind of vague when he gets the higher degrees. But between 1850 and the end of the Civil War in 1866, really the only way a person's going to get to degrees in this area is through communicating them. There just aren't enough gentlemen around to actually facilitate putting on the degrees in full. In 1860, we have A.T.C. Pearson is appointed as the first sovereign Grand Inspector General. And then shortly after that, in 1867, we have the very first body of the Scottish Rite being established in St. Paul with the Pearson Lodge of Perfection #1. And then that's where Minneapolis kind of starts coming into the story, which is in 1869. You know, things really don't get rolling because of the Civil War. The Civil War just sucks all the guys out of the state, and Masonry almost stops, in whole. So 1869, everybody's back, everybody's doing their thing again. And Minnesota has grown to a population of around 200,000 people. And of that population, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 men that are now Masons. We have 67 lodges, and we have 9 lodges under dispensation at that point. And that's where Alfred Ames starts making the first steps to establish the Valley of Minneapolis. But dun, 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 we have some fun controversy there. In 1854, Ames receives the honorable 33rd degree, but he gets that in a northern jurisdiction. So nobody really wants to listen to this guy when he starts talking about establishing a valley of the southern jurisdiction in Minneapolis. And Pike actually has to step in. And Pike recommends him for active membership in the southern jurisdiction on the Supreme Council. And at this time, he says of Ames that Ames cordially united with me in my efforts to initiate reform. We have no more earnest, devoted, or intelligent workmen in the jurisdiction than illustrious brother Ames. So that settles the controversy for Ames, and ultimately he is named the deputy for the city of Minneapolis in May of 1873. This allows him to organize bodies and confer degrees up to the 30th degree. So at this point, he literally hits the ground running. So he's named deputy in May. And in June, he's got 11 perfect Eludes and Masters of the Royal Secret from St. Paul that signed the petition to establish a Lodge of Perfection. And in June of 23rd of the same year, Sovereign Grand Commander Albert Pike issued letters of patent for Excelsior Lodge of Perfection number 3. And in December of that year, we have the Chapter of Rose Croix number 1 established. So all within the year of basically given clearance to start things, he's got the ball rolling. And unfortunately, he passes away in 74, just earlier the following year. And that's where things actually really fall apart. And it becomes a time of discontent and discouragement and struggle at best. The Valley really has a hard time pulling things together. So behind on the slides here, let's see here where we're at. Let's catch up. So Grand Master, New Jersey, or Northern Jurisdiction, Deputy, and then he passes away. And so we've got some pretty solid struggles that happen at that time. In 1878, there are no returns from any of the bodies in Minneapolis that are sent to the Supreme Council that year. And in 1879, Sovereign Grand Commander Albert Pike pays us a visit, and we are unable to make quorum, so we cannot give him an official reception or the honors that he's due. And even though that, he still confers degrees on people, so he must not have been too upset. And then in 1880, the Excelsior Lodge of Perfection number 1 sends in a petition to the Supreme Council for remission of dues, which just screams of major financial troubles for the Valley at that point. And that's actually quickly taken care of. There is a brother that it's a little unclear who this gentleman is, but may or may not be a relative of mine, pays for the dues out of his own pocket, and then is quickly paid back by the brothers taking up the collection, and they take care of the matter. And 1880 is really where those struggles end, and where we come to Samuel Emery Adams. He disassociates with St. Paul and comes to Minneapolis to assume control of the Valley, basically, at that point. Let me catch up on my notes here. So things turn around in 80, where we have the Council of Kadosh in 1880, February of 1880 is established. And then in April of 1880, we finally get a consistory. And that's where things really take off. By March of 1881, we have the first degrees from the new consistory being recorded, and we have 2 brothers that are consecrated Masters of the Royal Secret. And then by 82, we actually have our first honorary 33rd that assumes an active role on the council as Inspector General, and that is Robert Enos, if I'm saying his name correctly. So all of this stuff is said to happen due to Uncle Sam's encouragement, is part of the quote. And kind of where I feel is an appropriate place to kind of cap off this part is in 1884. Sam's given credit for growing the consistory from 27 members to 125 members, and we have 3 members at that time that are chosen for the honorary 33rd. So it really puts Minneapolis on the map And there's a quote that I found that it is clear that under the encouragement of Uncle Sam Adams, Minneapolis is among the leaders of the Southern jurisdiction. So at that point, we're really, you know, we've come into our own, and we have ups and downs from there, definitely. There's actually, it's not all hugs and kisses for the Scottish Rite in Minneapolis at all, because in 1880 we actually have the establishment of, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the Cerneau Rite, the CERNEAU, which is a completely different body of Scottish Rite. Don't quiz me on this, because this was the first time that I had actually heard about this. In 80, this other body is established in Minneapolis, and from my understanding, there was only one other place, and that was in California, that this existed. But it was so popular that it ultimately caused so much disturbance in the Blue Lodge that it was said to be disrupting the peace and harmony, because the two different versions of the Scottish Rite were fighting, and it spilled over into the daily operations of the Blue Lodge. And it became such an issue for Minnesota that in 1887, the Grand Lodge actually tried to pass some sort of thing that would stop this bickering, and they failed to pass it. And then ultimately in 1890, it had become such a major issue for the Scottish Rite and Masonry across the nation that several different Grand Lodges, including Minnesota, and here's how it's worded, declared the reception of or the conferring of Cerneau degrees to be a Masonic crime. And that shut down this other branch of the Scottish Rite. And you know, and this all happened underneath, you know, while Samuel Adams was in charge. So, you know, he definitely had his challenges. It wasn't all easy for him to kind of turn things around for us when we were having such a hard go of stuff. And ultimately, Sam dies in 1912. He passes away in the middle of the night, and that year, for the transactions of the Supreme Council in 1912, 1913, they actually pay tribute to him. And the quote from the transactions is, "He saw the Rite grow under his charge from 60 members to 2,700 members. Its satisfactory condition and progress is due to him more than any other person." So that feels like a good spot to kind of break this off. I highly encourage everybody to pick up from there and look at what we were doing throughout the rest of the course of history there. You know, you come up against World War I, and that completely reshapes the state and a lot of Masonry at that point. You know, I've looked into that for doing the history of Arcana. You know, we've got, much like today, we have a lot of civil unrest with labor that directly affects Minneapolis as a city, and, you know, affects all the guys in Masonry too at that point. So there's several different, very, very interesting parts of history to look at, and far too much to present in a short course like this. So that's where I'm going to stop. So if you have any questions, the joke all night has been ask Justin. So thank you.
Where could I learn more about the Cerneau Rite? This is the first I've heard of it.
You know, that's a good question. The material I was reading made it sound like, you know, it's a forgotten footnote, but it was a major disruption for a good solid decade there. I had never heard of it prior to coming across it and, you know, looking for this.
There are materials on the Scottish Rite National website about it.
And
I actually just found it.
But also the Grand Lodge of Minnesota put out a centennial book in 1953 And in it, it discusses the Sano issues.
Were you there for that,
Yeah,
Ted?
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
was. Thank you very
Yep.
kindly, Tom.
Yeah, what I read said it was extremely disruptive, where you would have, one group get into power in a Blue Lodge, and they would completely wipe out all of the other group of Scottish Rite members from power, and then the next election it would switch again, and then all those guys would get booted out in this other group. It really became a big issue within the Blue Lodges of
they
how
basically
disruptive
voted out.
it was.
They voted out the the officers that had been elected the previous year, despite where they were in the line. They would just vote them out and bring in their own people. So it went back and forth until, as you say, I think it was 1890 that the Grand Lodge,
Yeah.
the Grand Master, finally said it would basically be a Masonic crime to belong to the Cerno.
So Charlie,
Yeah.
really good job, but I'm in Stillwater, St. John's Lodge number 1. How does that fit in?
I don't know. There is controversy in terms of which lodge was first.
Right.
There are 3 or 4 lodges that all kind of vie for that spot. And even in the establishment of like the Rose Croix body that we have in Minneapolis, it claims to be first. But then if you look at the book I was, at the material I was looking at, it gives that credit to St. Paul and their Rose Croix. So there's a lot of competing information. I think it would take some pretty serious digging into to find.
You did a great job, so thank you.
If I could,
Thank you.
then we recall that 1880, 1890 was the time when Minneapolis population was surpassing St. Paul's, and there was a virtual unending war between the two towns in terms of population, and undoubtedly that passed over to lodges and the Rite as to who did what when. And you're 30 years down the road and people are trying to say, well, I did this on this day, I did that day. It all fits in with the general theme of one city competing with the other. At that time, that somebody would say, I did it first. No, I did it first. End of story.
I can tell you that there's nowhere in the southern jurisdiction that I'm aware of where there are 2 valleys within 10 miles of each other like we have.
No, someone talked about that. And they unless there's one over by House of the Temple, maybe across state lines or something, we're undoubtedly, unless there's something like that, the only one with 2 big valleys close to each other like we are.
Yeah, I found it interesting that, excuse me, in 78, when it's becoming apparent that Minneapolis is dying on the vine. We don't have enough membership to make quorum for things. We're not paying our bills. It's almost done. And Sam Adams is tapped to come over to Minneapolis. He disassociates with St. Paul and he completely picks up and moves over here. He stops going to lodge. So he originally was in Monticello, and then he moved back down into the cities later on in life to assume roles in the government here after the Civil War. And he's going to lodge in St. Paul. He disassociates completely with St. Paul and comes over to Minneapolis, where he joins 19 and then joins the Minneapolis Valley of the Scottish Rite.
That's an interesting one, Charlie. So Sam was a member of a number of lodges, but he grounded in Minneapolis 19 when he came to Minneapolis Valley. Yeah,
and it's just because I know, being a part of the family, I have a little bit more history. He raised his boys in 19. So Henry Rice Adams is his son, and Henry Rice ends up starting his own lodge, which was Minneapolis 224, I believe was the number. And he ultimately becomes Grandmaster at some point. And then it skips a generation. Henry didn't have any sons, so the next generation would have been my direct grandfather. And Grandpa Chuck was initially raised in Henry's lodge, but then ultimately ends up also being affiliated with 19. So I find it interesting that the Adams clan kind of ultimately makes 19 home, even though, you know, great Grandpa Sam started Monticello, and you know, they didn't stay there.
Interesting. Very good.
Well,
Very good.
thank you, Charlie.
Thank you guys.
Yes. So, brothers, I put the survey link into the chat. If you would be kind enough to please submit that. It'll also come in via email. So if you don't get it, do in you know, the next day or so. Again, the schedule coming up here for the sessions, and that is the end that we have for this evening. I am going to stop the recording.